Tonight on Primetime Politics, choice words.
You read your comments yesterday, the Quebec Premier was calling.
No, I said what I said.
Canada's new Minister for Official Languages is forced to defend his words and record, answering for a comment he made about the state of the French language in Quebec. Does this controversy have the potential to hurt the Carney government? We will examine the fallout. And
we are putting a lot on the table and getting nothing in return.
the federal government is putting a lot of political capital into pipelines, but what might have been the greener alternative? We'll speak to former Toronto Mayor David Miller, who now leads up a group called Elbows Up for Climate. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Serapio. We'll get to those stories in a moment, but first, some developing news out of Victoria tonight, as John Rustad has been ousted as leader of the BC Conservative Party. Tossed out after a majority of his caucus expressed a lack of confidence in his leadership, and despite an earlier comment from Rustad himself today, stating he intended to stay.
Like I've just said, I am planning to stay on as the Conservative leader of the Conservative Party British Columbia leader. I'm not planning to step aside at this point. There's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Now, John Rustad's removal comes just 13 months after nearly winning the provincial election, but his leadership style and his management of caucus was widely criticized. His party has now declared him professionally incapacitated, and Conservative MLA Trevor Halford has now been named interim leader. But Rustad says in a social media post that, quote, "I have not resigned, I have not been removed, and I am not going anywhere. A political party's board can throw around whatever creative terminology they like. Professional incapacitation, give me a break. Let me be clear," says Rustad, "that's not a constitutional mechanism." So we are very much following the story closely here on CPAC. Well, back here in Ottawa, concerns about the MOU signed with Alberta last week continue to be expressed, with Steven Guilbeault, the former Minister for Canadian Identity in the Carney government and the former Environment Minister in the Trudeau government, saying the country is not getting much in exchange for dropping environmental regulations for Alberta.
I sincerely doubt that the new pipeline will ever get built. We still have carbon pricing, and we will continue having an industrial carbon pricing, but I disagree with some of the fundamental elements in this memorandum of understanding. I think we are putting a lot on the table and getting nothing in return. This idea that we're somehow winning because Alberta is going to increase its industrial price, they need to do that under the federal system anyway.
Well, with more on the environmental concerns about the MOU signed last week, we're now joined by David Miller. From 2003 to 2010, Mr. Miller was the mayor of Toronto. He now co-chairs Elbows Up for Climate, which is a group of municipal leaders advocating for national projects and policies that have climate in mind. David Miller, good to see you again.
It's very good to see you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Happy to have you here. And I should also note that you're also the managing director of the C40 Centre, which is a global network of mayors who work for climate action on the municipal level. So obviously you have the green credentials when we start this conversation. And to that, in regards to the Elbows Up for Climate, your organization did release a statement on the MOU last week. You say in part the following: "It is deeply troubling that the Prime Minister has chosen to prioritize the subsidization of fossil fuel projects to benefit some of the world's richest companies and increase their vast profits at the expense of our communities." I will say that is not the argument that you'll hear from the Prime Minister. He says nothing about making rich companies richer. For him, this is about getting a Canadian product to market. Quite frankly, the only product that Canada has that the world truly wants, at a time when Canadian exports to the United States are at their lowest level in decades. Are you ignoring the economic reality that this country faces by speaking out against this MOU?
It's a very fair question. The answer to that is no, we're doing exactly the opposite. The coalition I co-chair with Mayor Valerie Plante represents municipal leaders, often from cities and towns across Canada, who've already faced climate disasters, like Jasper, for example, which had over 30% of its buildings burn literally overnight. I mean, it's an extraordinary impact on the people of that city, the businesses, and the economy. And what we're saying is, federal funding shouldn't subsidize making that problem worse, which this deal and the associated changes to methane regulations, for example, will. It'll make climate change worse and will do less to help solve the problem. Instead, we should think about building an economy in this country that works for people and is clean. And we've proposed 5 nation-building projects like a national energy grid. You know, Canada's a big supplier of clean electricity. But it's easier for us to sell it to the U.S. than it is for BC to sell it to Alberta, for example. We could create a clean energy grid across this country. We could create a rapid train network supplemented by electric buses. We could build 2 million units of housing that are needed, and I'm here in Ottawa for the Canadian Urban Institute conference about housing, and build them using sustainable materials, sustainable methods, sustainable strategies, solving 2 problems at once. We can retrofit the housing we have, and the federal government could fund a national resilience strategy. What happens when you have to evacuate a place like Jasper on no notice, virtually no notice? What happens? How do you fund the recovery? It's not just about insurance. What's the federal role in helping people prepare? Jasper was actually quite prepared, but what's the federal role there? And those kinds of projects are a better choice for federal spending, create more jobs, and help our cities and towns adapt.
Let me pick up on more jobs, because, you know, ultimately, though, what the Prime Minister is trying to do here with these major projects is to have, and this is his words, to have this catalytic effect in that, for example, with pipelines. There's no pipeline yet, but by dropping regulations, he is trying to encourage private investment to put money forward, which would then catalyze other investment on associated things like concrete, steel. How do the projects you talk about, what type of economic impact will it have to encourage other investment in this country? Because ultimately that has been a long-standing problem for Canada.
Well, if you think about building a national electricity grid, right? Our system is provincial. Think about the steel and aluminum that's involved in that, the construction jobs, good union jobs, by the way, well-paid union jobs all across this country. If you think about doing the work that's necessary to do energy retrofits on buildings to lessen their use of fossil fuels, lower our impact on the planet, that's tens, if not hundreds of thousands of good, well-trained, skilled trades, likely union jobs.
But it sounds like public money, though, not private investment, and that's ultimately what they're trying to move here.
There's can be lots of private investment here, particularly around buildings, but there is huge public subsidies going to the oil companies here. It's a little bit hidden, but through the Pathways project, the project that's going to sequester carbon, and then, by the way, going to reuse it to exploit more oil, which is a really negative thing, and it's why Elizabeth May won't support this, despite promises from the Prime Minister. But there are huge public subsidies involved in that. Our argument is repurpose that money to help build the infrastructure that Canada needs, that people have been talking about for at least a decade, about a national clean grid, about a building retrofit strategy, about building the new homes that the government is already funding in a sustainable way. That's a far more successful use for the economy in the long run of scarce public funds than using them to subsidize the oil companies, most of which are big multinationals and have a lot of money.
How does that, though, address the challenge of exports? Because, again, we are now at this lowest level of exports to the United States in decades as a result of what's happening with Donald Trump. And add to that the stated goal of this government to double our exports to countries beyond the United States. I hear that the projects that you were naming here, but they ultimately are domestic products, not about getting the world to buy Canadian.
So 3 comments on that. Okay. First of all, if you're talking about exporting oil products, we already have a pipeline to the coast that the federal government built at great expense to public funds, and its capacity can be expanded easily and inexpensively and not have the really serious potential environmental risk of a pipeline of diluted bitumen going through the Great Bear Rainforest, pristine rainforest, and past some of the most important fishing grounds in the world, which will be destroyed if there's an accident. That's the risk they're taking. So we're already doing that. If you look at the kinds of projects we're talking about, yes, they're made in Canada, They use Canadian materials, Canadian jobs. But, you know, when the U.S. first put the tariffs on, one of the reasons we didn't go into as bad a recession as economists thought was because people were buying Canadian. So there's merit to that. The third thing is, you know, one of the areas we're losing in exports that's really critical, people aren't talking about, is advanced manufacturing, including cars. The tariffs have really, really hurt there. And there's a way to use domestic procurement policies of the governments, selected partnerships with the right companies to push back against that and really increase our advanced manufacturing. For example, Bombardier's discussions with Saab about building jets instead of buying American ones. Those kinds of things can help ensure that we can trade with others. It's not just about natural resources. And in Ontario, may not feel like in Ottawa, but certainly in and around Toronto, that advanced manufacturing is the backbone of our economy. And we really need to make sure it succeeds.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're talking to someone who lived in Oshawa, so I hear what you're saying about that.
You know very well indeed.
But, you know, but still, I don't know if that solves the export problem, nor does it, for example, inspire international investors. You mentioned Saab, but where else does that come from? Because at the end of the day, if you can get the oil to Asia, there is a demand in Asia. And at the end of the day, when you look at the Great Recession back in 2007 to 2009, Canada did not suffer as much as other countries, in part because of our oil exports, which the world wanted and, quite frankly, still wants.
Well, I would push back on that quite a bit. I mean, I work for an international coalition of mayors of the world's biggest cities, and if you look at what's going on in the world now, it's moving to clean energy at a rapid pace because it's so cheap. And, you know, if you're going to have an agreement with Alberta around something like this, at a minimum, they should be allowing their clean energy. They have massive potential capacity, which the provincial government stopped. And if you look, Abacus had an interesting poll this summer in June, in which 2/3 of Canadians said, we prefer clean energy to conventional oil. And that's where the world is going. And yes, could Canada sell some products in the short term? Possibly. But a pipeline like you're talking about is going to take a decade or more to build. And China is changing. It's doing incredible things in clean energy. Yes, it still has dirty energy. Africa is changing. Latin America is changing. Canada needs to be part of that movement. And if it was, we'd create a different kind of economy, but one that has a very strong Made in Canada component with lots of jobs. And that's what the mayors are arguing. You know, they're not just saying protect our cities and towns. They're saying we suffered from climate change. We suffered from wildfires. It's time for us to act and build a different kind of economy that helps solve the problem, not make it worse.
David Miller, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this.
Thanks for having me on.
The Prime Minister was forced to defend Marc Miller in question period today, put on the spot by the Bloc Québécois leader, who asked who will speak for the French language and culture. This after Miller, the minister responsible for official languages, said on Tuesday that he refuses to accept the notion that French is in complete decline in Quebec. A choice of words that has sparked strong reaction among Quebec nationalists. Take a listen to what the Prime Minister said in the comments.
Monsieur le Président, étant Premier ministre, étant anglophone, je vais protéger la langue française. Je vais protéger la culture québécoise.
Exactement. Well, to talk about this, we're now joined by Martine Saint-Victor, communication strategist and general manager at Edelman in Montreal, and Jonathan Kalles, vice president at Macmillan Vantage, and also a former Quebec advisor to Justin Trudeau. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Listen, Martine.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, Jonathan. Listen, Martine, I'm going to ask you to start us off here because I wonder about the impact of Marc Miller's comments here. Of course, he's no political neophyte. People know him in Quebec and throughout the country. But has his comments about the state of the French language hurt him and, by extension, hurt the Carney government in Quebec?
I don't know if it's hurt him. What I would like to say is that he's very appreciated in his writing. And I think nuance also is extremely important in this context. One of the issues Mr. Miller has had is the fact that Premier Legault has brought up more than once in the past that the spoken language at home, the percentage of Quebecers who speak French at home had gone down. And what Mr. Miller has brought up, and he brought it up again yesterday, is that the fact that people don't necessarily speak French at home doesn't necessarily mean that they don't speak French once they leave the house. And he gave the example of his own family. He said, at home we speak Swedish. Does that affect the French language? It doesn't. Then he gave the fact that he did the vast majority of his schooling in French. And so I think this nuance is important. The other nuance that's important is that the way that Premier Legault speaks of Mr. Miller, it's as if he's not from Quebec. He is. And so when he's been attacked left and right, and it's very bizarre to hear some of the comments, and it's as if they're talking about him as if he were an outsider. He is not.
Jonathan, what do you say to that? Has this comment or this commentary hurt Marc Miller and by extension the federal government?
I don't think it's hurt Marc Miller, and I'm not sure in the long run, even in the medium term, it'll hurt the federal government. Marc Miller, I think both Martine and I would agree, is somebody who speaks his mind, but he's also just generally a very good communicator. So he probably, if he were to do it all over again, probably would have been a little extra nuanced because he's become a bit of a lightning rod. And both the CAQ and François Legault's government, which is, sitting in the teens in popular support and looking like they're going to get a shutout in the next election, and the Parti Québécois and its leader, Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, who now has a 20-point lead almost in the polls, both of them love fighting with Marc Miller, because Marc Miller is this sort of epitome of Justin Trudeau's friend, the Trudeauist, federalist, evil, trying to impose English and destroy the French language. So Martine's very right when she says a lot of this requires a lot of nuance, but right now we're talking about the pure nasty part of politics, which is you pick up, maybe even out of context, or take just a part of a sentence, throw it out there and go after somebody. But especially, I would say right now for the Legault government and his comments yesterday, really trying to grab at anything that will improve their numbers. And as for Mr. Plamondon, well, Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon and Marc Miller went to law school together. They've known each other for a long time. This is now just a matter of fodder. Mr. Saint-Pierre Plamondon's comments today were even more outrageous, if you can believe it, than Legault's yesterday, where he claimed that the cultural milieu, who sent, congratulatory emails and letters to Marc Miller on his new post, called them pretty much traitors for doing that. So the hyperbole is, at a new level, and with an election less than 10 months away, I think we can only expect more, not less.
Okay, and when you say that, Jonathan, I underline the part that François Legault does have very low approval numbers. I think he's actually the least approved of leader in the country right now. But when he uses that type of hyperbole, to use your terminology there, Jonathan, does that actually have resonance, though? Because at the end of the day, Mr. Legault can say whatever he wants to say, but does it have resonance across the province?
Well, we saw a poll today that, despite the provincial Liberals really in the middle of their own controversy, going down 6-7 points, the Legault government didn't pick up a single point out of that. So it seems like whatever they do right now, they're really at a fin de regime, the end of their mandate, and I don't think that anything they're going to do is change their fortunes, unless they maybe change their leader that worked federally. It's what you see from François Legault is a lot of flailing. Now, will anybody in Quebec be offended by what Marc Miller said, taken out of context? I'm sure that's sort of easy fodder, but I don't think in the midterm it's really going to drive anyone, because anybody who would be impacted by that kind of hyperbole probably already wouldn't vote for the Liberals federally and probably aren't a loss in a sense in the long run. You have to be careful. There are a bunch of very close ridings to the bloc that were won in the last election by hundreds, if not a single vote in Terrebonne. And, in an election that could be coming up as soon as, the next 4, 5, 6 months, you have to be careful. You don't want to alienate any voter, but I don't think it's going to have a massive impact.
Okay, listen, I want to, Martine, I'll get you to comment in a moment, but I want to play here right now some words that we heard from Minister Miller today in Ottawa. He talks about all that he has done in terms of policy and funding choices in the past to promote the French language in Quebec and throughout the country, for that matter. Take a listen right now to Marc Miller.
Your comments yesterday, the Quebec Premier was calling.
No, I said what I said, and I think I've made I've proved in my previous roles that in doubling French immigration in Canada, which is something the federal government had never done, and been part of a government that recognized the decline of the French language across Canada. And modified the law on official languages as a result, plus the $4 million investment, and send $800 million to Quebec for francization of new arrivals. It's nice to talk, but actions count, and I think I've proved myself.
So he says his actions count. Martine, will this quickly go away? Is that the strategy he needs to take, just to, try not to comment on it and let his actions speak for themselves, or does he have to be a bit more active to address the issue in Quebec?
I think this will go away. Jono can attest to the fact that 3 weeks ago, the brouhaha were between the Premier and doctors. Last week it was with unions. This week it's Marc Miller. Next week it will be somebody else. And he was right to point out his successes. People don't remember that, and they certainly don't have it on top of mind. So he was right to remind everybody of that. But he does need to move on. And I will say this. He was very appreciated when he was Minister of Indigenous Affairs. He learned the language. That was very appreciated. It showed us a very sensible side to him, which is always a good thing for politicians to be able to showcase. And I think also, big picture is that in Quebec, we certainly appreciated that Mr. Carney picked a minister from Quebec. And so I do think this will go away.
Okay. Listen, let's move on from this, because I also want to talk about Steven Guilbeault here, because of course Marc Miller is back in cabinet, not only because, but really put into cabinet right now because Steven Guilbeault resigns over the MOU Ottawa signs with Alberta. I'm wondering, given Steven Guilbeault's status in Quebec, does his resignation from the federal cabinet, not the government, but from the federal cabinet, does that have an impact in the province as to how Quebecers view the Liberal Party, Jono?
I think to an extent in the short term, yes, he's got great recognition. People know who he is, and he's not a new face on the environment, but really on the public scene. He was on Tout le monde en parle on Sunday nights, the most watched TV program in Quebec, and he was very emotional about his choice. But it was not a tear it down, burn it down resignation. This was not Chrystia Freeland of a year ago. This is not Jody Wilson-Raybould of 7-8 years ago. This was a very dignified, decision where he said, listen, we agree to disagree. I have enormous respect for the Prime Minister, and, I have to be able to look myself in the mirror. I think they both, behaved in a smart way where they were respectful, and that's what happens sometimes in politics. Steven Guilbeault has, again, he's well known, but I'm not sure outside of Montreal he's that influential that people will follow everything that he says. You have a government in Quebec that's been elected now twice that has had no environmental plan whatsoever in the CAQ. So it's not, like the rest of Canada, the single biggest issue right now for Canadian and for Quebec voters.
Mm-hmm. Martine, what do you say about that, the impact of Steven Guilbeault's resignation from cabinet?
I think for a politician at large, it was a good thing. I think it restored trust because, as Jono said, he didn't leave with fracas. He left with dignity, with a lot of respect for his boss. And also it reminded us as electors that politicians are not robots. The fact that he showed so much emotion, I don't think anybody in good faith could question his sincerity. And I do think to restore trust in politicians, it might go a long way, because sometimes we wonder, do politicians really believe what they're trying to sell? And here we have an example that often they do. And it follows a former minister who left the CAC a couple of weeks ago because he couldn't go along with the new law regarding doctors. And I think these two events back to back really will help restore faith and trust in politicians. And certainly for Mr. Guilbeault, his departure was applauded. You have to remember that when he took on the position, there were a lot of people from the climate justice and environment that question his choice and question his commitment. And I think now he kind of restored that and will become a voice and certainly the face of what to do right next. Nobody can question his capacities and his knowledge of what's best for climate change. So against climate change. So I think for him for his brand, if you will, personal brand, it's only good news because we know that he puts his faith in what he believes in.
Puts his faith in what he believes in. Jonathan, I'm going to pick up on a point that you said though about the environment not figuring very large right now amongst Quebecers in terms of priority, because it has been suggested when here in Ottawa when people are talking that this MOU in Alberta with Alberta rather could hurt the Prime Minister in British Columbia, but also in Quebec, considering there were many progressive votes who lent their vote to the Liberals in the last federal campaign. What do you say to that?
I think there's always a risk of that. I think that's a fair question. But, especially in the context of tariffs and Trump and the current economic context, the insecurity, add that on top of what was already serious challenge in terms of cost of living for every Canadian, every Quebecer. And I said this going back in March, April during the election campaign. Quebec voters are like Canadian voters. What was on their mind was tariffs and trade and cost of living. And I don't think that that's dramatically changed. So I don't think you have a perception that Marc Carney is anti-environment. He's taking a different tack. Steven Guilbeault disagrees with that tack, but it's not like he's a climate science denier or he doesn't believe in these things. He has a different strategy to achieve net zero, let's say in 2050. He's still committed to that. He made that clear, the Prime Minister. And so Quebec voters, when it comes to an election, they'll have to ask themselves, yes, it's important to me, the environment, but is it more important than these other measures? And do I have confidence in Marc Carney? He'll have to deliver on a lot of the promises that he made, during the campaign and over the last 6 months, whenever that next election comes. His main opponent's going to be the Bloc Québécois, because the Conservatives certainly aren't any stronger on the environment. They have climate deniers there. But the Bloc, you have their leader, who's a former environment minister, who has a pretty lousy record on the environment too. So yes, it's important, but I don't think it's decisive.
Yeah. Martine, what would you say to that?
Yes, I will say we need to watch for the generational divide. Gen Z, it's survey after survey, the most important thing for them is the environment. Now, are they the largest voting bloc? They weren't the last election around, but this might be the issue that gets them to the polls next time. So I think this is something that we have to watch for, because for Gen Z, it is a priority. And I think also we have to look at what's going on a larger scale. When you remember the op-ed that Bill Gates recently published in the New York Times, where he kind of backtracked a little bit on the urgency of climate change. And so Canada has often been a leader, and let's see if the country will continue to be one. Steven Guilbeault did say that he would try to continue to influence, and this is why I do believe that he's going to continue to be a leader, but just in a different capacity. He will continue to be a leader fighting the good fight, but in a different capacity.
Martine, Jonathan, appreciate the time. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Avec plaisir. Au revoir.
Au revoir. And that is Primetime Politics for this Wednesday. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.